Good afternoon. My name is Luke Way. I'm professor of political science at the University of Toronto. It's an enormous pleasure to have today Mr. Luke Harding, who's just written this very timely book, Invasion, that covers the first 7 or so months of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is one of the first among many books that will be coming, and I would argue sort of ahead of time that this is among the best. Luke Harding is a journalist, writer, and award-winning correspondent for The Guardian. I first knew him because of this book, which is a fantastic account of Russian intervention in the 2016 election. Luke has been, is supremely qualified to write this book. He's been working in the region for over 15 years, covering both Russia and Ukraine. And he's written a really fantastic book that takes us really to the front lines of the conflict. I was almost kind of worried for him, when I hear about sort of him being shot at. I'm not sure how his family feels about being so close to the war. But it's a truly dramatic and harrowing account that covers focuses on the main sites of the conflict: Bucha, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, the nuclear power plant, and you can almost smell the HIMARS. So I highly recommend this book. So today we're just going to talk about the war and where it's progressing, and sort of some of Mr. Harding's thoughts on the conflict. So Luke, let's just start. I just wanted to ask you, you spent a number of years in Moscow covering Russian politics. Put simply, why do you think Putin decided to conduct a full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be with you. Really nice to see you. Greetings from broken Britain, where I am at the moment. A country which I can tell you is in some ways less functional than Ukraine at war. But anyway, I think Putin has been obsessed with Ukraine for a long time. Certainly when I was in Moscow for The Guardian as the Guardian's bureau chief between 2007 and 2011, Ukraine was a kind of growing theme. And there was, one of the stories I reported on, which everyone's forgotten about now, was Russia's invasion of Georgia in the summer of 2008, August 2008. It was a short, unlike this war, it's a short 5-day war where actually the Russian army sort of pretty triumphantly crushed the Georgians. At one point, I found myself in a car following a Russian tank column trundling towards the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, uncertain whether it was going to go and seize the capital, depose Saakashvili. And in the end, it turned left about 40 kilometers sort of shy. And so that clearly the plan was just to humiliate Saakashvili rather than remove him. But I think that was a sort of brutal exercise in power, in neighborhood sort of geopolitics. And off the back of that, everyone started talking about Ukraine. And so my first book about Russia called Mafia State, which I published after I got kicked out in 2011. Just before that, I went to Crimea. And wrote a sort of counterfactual piece for The Guardian about how easy it would be to seize Crimea, that you could, because there were so many Russian troops, sailors there already, you could raise a flag in Sevastopol, the port, and so on and so on. And it's not that I'm Nostradamus, Lucan, it's just that actually that turned out to be more or less exactly what happened in 2014. So I went back in 2014, I spent time in Luhansk and Donetsk, these twin cities in the east, just as Putin basically kickstarted an anti-Kiev insurrection, which was orchestrated, funded, financed, run out of Moscow. It had some local support, but essentially this was a Russian special operation. So unthinkable things kept on happening in Ukraine. And of course, basically, we know what Putin said about the 2014 Maidan protests. They were organized by the CIA. Probably Canadian intelligence had a hand in it, according to Putin. You guys were involved there, I'm sure. So, so essentially, when this troop buildup started happening in the spring and then the autumn of 2021, I got on a plane, went back to Ukraine again, went to with Ukrainian soldiers outside Donetsk, went to Mariupol in January of last year, about 4 weeks before the invasion, because I knowing Putin's obsession, having read his essay, which I write about in the book, where he says essentially Ukraine is not a country. That's always been his view, that this territory is historical Russia. I feared the worst. And I was convinced there was going to be some kind of large-scale military operation. I wasn't sure whether it be east or south or north or some combination. And so it proved. I mean, just to wrap up, essentially Putin thinks Ukraine is not a state. He thinks it's not a nation. He thinks Ukrainians are not a people. He thinks essentially that they can either be turned into good Russians and accept his dominion, or they can be destroyed and annihilated. And really what we're seeing, in my view, at the heart of Europe is a genocidal project as ambitious as what we saw in the 1930s. Essentially, it's kind of fascistic, really. I mean, I know we're a bit wary of using that word, but I think what we're seeing is Russian fascism. And my job as a reporter, as a writer, has been to chronicle this.
So that's interesting what you said. I mean, you're absolutely right that Putin has been obsessed with Ukraine, and as most Russians. I mean, I think the first Russian phrase I ever learned when I was in Moscow in 1989 or 1991 was "Krim nash."
Krim nash.
Crimea is ours. That was literally the first, after I got off the plane. But what's to me puzzling is the fact that before 2014, Russia, of course, had enormous sources of influence within Ukraine and sort of had access to a number of pro-Russian parties, and basically every sort of other presidential election, it got a person in office who's who listened to Putin and was influenced by him. And I wonder, I mean, looking at it from the outside, like, I mean, what, why would you do something to sort of basically shoot yourself in the foot and eliminate these sources of influence, as has happened, both in the 2014 partial invasion and in the 2022 full-scale invasion?
Yeah, I mean, I think the country. I mean, first thing to say, I think the country has changed enormously over the past 8 years. And one of the ironies of all this is that Putin complains that Ukraine has become this insufferable anti-Russian project. Well, he is actually absolutely the person who made it an anti-Russian project. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, I think we have to be careful not to make the Elon Musk mistake to conflate kind of what language you speak with what your political allegiance is, because that's not the case. But it's true to say that up until 2014, there was some support for Russia. Certainly in Crimea, certainly in the East. I spent a lot of time in both places. I don't think it was ever a majority. I don't think if there'd been a free and fair poll that the secessionist movement was that large, but it definitely existed, particularly among older people. And that was, that was something that was a kind of ingress. Those were people that Putin could use, instrumentalize, agitate with, propagandize, and so on. But I think the country has changed. I mean, I think Crimea was in response to what Putin regarded as a anti-Russian coup. But what he fails to do, and actually what some kind of people from America, Canada, Britain do on the far left, is to ascribe any kind of agency to Ukrainians themselves. I mean, I write this in Invasion. They're kind of non-people. They kind of float outside his mental world. I mean, he doesn't really recognize them as Ukrainians. The idea they might have yearnings, hopes, aspirations, it doesn't really kind of figure at all. And what happened after 2014 is that actually Ukraine consolidated around Ukraine. I mean, I was talking to the head of foreign intelligence on the eve of invasion, who said that Putin had done more for boosting support for NATO in Ukraine than anyone else. This wasn't NATO, this was Putin. And same with the Ukrainian language. And I went to Avdiivka just before the invasion, and it really changed. Somewhere I used to go to a lot as well. It had become Ukrainian. There were Ukrainian flags everywhere. The kids were all speaking Ukrainian or learning Ukrainian in school. Same with Mariupol. I mean, these cities had kind of prospered in those 8 years. And I think, Putin's made very many errors, but I think his biggest sort of strategic blunder, military blunder, conceptual blunder, was to think that the Ukraine of 2022 was the Ukraine of 2014. It was a very different country. It was much more coherent, less corrupt, less malleable. And it turned out led by someone who has proved to be a leader of genius.
Absolutely. I mean, it is quite striking just how, to lack of another word, stupid the Russian elite has been about Ukraine. I mean, you'd think this is not Mars. This is a country that most of them have been to. Many of them have close friends with. This is, it's like, it would be like sort of being in Canada and having Canadians not understand the U.S. politics. And I'm just wondering, my own experience of this is during the Orange Revolution. I have a number of sort of former dissident friends, and I had just been there, and I came to Moscow, and people who are really smart, nuanced thinkers were talking about Yushchenko as the sort of neo-Nazi kind of, and I just don't understand the sources of this stupidity. Can you enlighten us?
Yes. I mean, it's a really interesting conversation. It's a conversation I'm still having with very many kind of friends and contacts in Kiev. I mean, they say various things when we talk about this. I mean, one is the phrase I hear is a kind of cultural imbalance. In other words, Ukrainians have always understood Russians better than Russians have understood Ukrainians. That's partly about a function of language. I mean, Ukrainians are bilingual. Everyone speaks Russian and Ukrainian. I don't really speak Ukrainian, but I do speak Russian all the time in Ukraine, and no one stops me. Everyone's quite happy to speak Russian to me. So the idea that Putin is saving Russian speakers when he's murdered tens of thousands of Russian speakers in the East, Mariupol, Kherson, and so on, is laughable. And the other, I think, is kind of cultural. I mean, I've had interesting conversations with the director of the Ukrainian Institute here, particularly over Mikhail Bulgakov is a flashpoint. When the invasion started, I was reading The White Guard. This is a classic novel set in 1918. And Bulgakov, I mean, I just read a piece about this for The Guardian. He's not much liked. He's regarded as being essentially a kind of Russian nationalist. Now, there's a counter case to say he's a man of his time, but what's certainly true is that he did not believe in Ukrainian statehood, and he tended to regard, pro-Ukrainians as a kind of inchoate peasant mass. In contrast to the sort of civilized literate elite in Kiev, and some of that prejudice, I think, is genuinely there. There's a sort of chauvinistic view which you find in literature or in some literature, but you certainly find in Kremlin thinking. I mean, my sort of chapter on this in the book is called "The Lost Kingdom." They genuinely believe that Ukrainians are sort of the country cousins, and they just need to be kind of reunited with a great empire. And I think the other thing which plays very much into Russian thinking is the power of example, because if Ukraine can be a progressive, democratic, digital, successful, pro-European state full of Russian speakers, then why can't Russia? I mean, answer, because it's a corrupt, or I would say argue hyper-corrupt, clannish, feudal, mafia, autocratic. I mean, certainly autocratic. I'd say now kind of totalitarian society, blending elements from the Soviet Union, blending, what you probably could call imperial nostalgia. I mean, a lot of Putin's thinking comes straight out of the first half of the 19th century. His ideas about nationality and narodnost, orthodoxy, and so on. The whole spiritual component to this war from the Russian side, and so we've got two different worlds which are kind of colliding. One looking to the future, the other looking to the past. Not only the recent past, but the distant past. And just one last thing, which I think is intriguing. I mean, if you read his essay, and I would urge anyone who hasn't read it, read his essay, because generally when Putin says something, it kind of reflects what he's thinking. And he says, Ukraine was never a state going back to the 9th century. There was always this sort of spiritual, cultural, language unity between Ukraine and Russia, common civilizational origin, and these two entities have been sundered by evil foreigners, the Mongols in the 12th century, then the vile Poles in the 15th, 16th century, latterly the perfidious West, you guys, the Canadians, Americans, Brits, etc. But the person he blames as well, which I think is just delightful, is Vladimir Lenin. Lenin is the villain. He's the arch villain for creating this Ukrainian socialist republic in the 1920s and giving it kind of co-equal status with Russia. And this is a man who served in the KGB, who saluted the flag, who was a believer in communist orthodoxy, and now he's trashing Lenin. Meanwhile, in occupied areas, Lenin is going back on his pedestal. And essentially, it speaks to the fact that this project, from the Russian point of view, whatever the great power fantasies, is completely incoherent, and I think ultimately will fail, and that's one of the reasons why it will fail.
Yeah, absolutely. It's truly bizarre that someone who treats the collapse of the Soviet Union as a major tragedy is so dismissive of Lenin, who after all created the Soviet Union. Okay, so let's just talk about the invasion. You were on there. You were having it at a dinner party, I believe, and so just tell us, what was it like? I mean, Zelensky had been saying that the Russians wouldn't invade, and suddenly he invaded. Take us to the moment.
Well, I mean, it was all a bit surreal. I mean, it's in a way, it's quite hard to. I mean, when I was writing the book, I had to sort of go back to January, February, and I try in the opening chapters to kind of recreate the opening chapters, sort of recreate the mood. Basically, Ukrainians didn't want to believe that Russia was going to do a full-scale invasion, and in a way, Zelensky, who I describe him as various things. I call him an anti-Tsar. I call him the amplifier in chief. He was very much sort of shaping that mood. I mean, at one point, the Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, said, "Take it easy. This is about 3 weeks before the invasion." And, I asked Zelensky about this in a press conference. I said, look, the US ambassador, Canadian ambassador, they've left. They've scooted westwards. And you're not very happy about this. Why is that? And his reply to me was, we do not have a Titanic situation here. And he was worried about scaring off investors. He was worried about a mood of panic. And so what that meant sort of in practical terms was that on the eve of invasion, on the 23rd of February, I was wandering around. By this point, it was pretty clear to me that war was coming. Wandering around, restaurants were open. People were walking their dogs, having drinks, flirting, life in all of its kind of gloriousness was continuing. And I went and had dinner I've been invited to dinner by Andrei Kurkov, whom your distinguished viewers will know. I mean, he's Ukraine's most famous living novelist. He's the author of Death of a Penguin, Grey Bees, terrific novel if you haven't read it. Also of where is it? I've got it on my bookshelf somewhere. Oh yeah, hang on, bear with me. This great book, Diary of an Invasion, which came out recently, which are his kind of war diaries. And I'd met him a few times, and he invited me for borscht. So I filed my story. I was a bit late. I dropped into a kind of a wine shop which was open, bought a bottle of Odessan wine, rushed around to his flat just around the corner from my hotel in the historic center of Kiev. And we had wine, we had zakuski, we had honey vodka. He showed me these files he got from the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, from 100 years before, which the daughter of some KGB general had given him, which is going to featuring in his current novel, of people who've been arrested by the Red Army, by the communist secret police, and detained, and we were looking at the case files and so on. And he was kind of optimistic that probably it would be okay. And by this point, I was very pessimistic. I really thought that a storm was coming. And writing about that period, Zelensky was slightly behind the curve. I mean, he got on his front foot subsequently, but he too could not quite recognize this great dark cloud that was advancing. And after the dinner party, we kind of hugged. I embraced him. I embraced Andrei's wife, British wife Elizabeth. Went out into the street, and I took a call from a very good source of mine, who had worked in the Ukrainian foreign ministry before at quite a high level, who knew a lot of people, a lot of staff. And he just said, the invasion is going to start at 4 a.m. And I looked up and there was a sort of dark velvet sky. I went back to the hotel. I slept a couple of hours. And sure enough, 4:30 in the morning, first explosions in the outskirts of Kiev. And it was happening. And when it sort of came home to me, when I sort of felt it emotionally, and again, I try and capture some of this in the book, was about 6 in the morning. We all, of course, went to the basement and took cover there, all the people in the hotel, the staff, journalists, and so on. 6 in the morning, a mum comes in with her 2 small kids who she'd got out of bed. And they're looking kind of like really wrung out. And they've got these little, rather sweet coloring books. And they start doing their coloring on the chairs. And I just realized that actually, I'd written so much about geopolitics, about press conferences, about visits by Boris Johnson, Justin Trudeau, etc., that actually ultimately this was a human tragedy. And I've done a lot of war reporting before in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And it was clear that these kids would probably survive, but other kids would die, as indeed they have. That civilians would die. I mean, we 500 kids have died, upwards of 16,000 civilians. There are people still entombed in the ruins of Mariupol. And I just thought, this is what I will write about. Obviously, I write about the high politics, but I'm going to write about the human tragedy.
Absolutely. No, it's horrific. So, I remember that time as well. I mean, I was here in Toronto, but and I also remember being very pessimistic. I mean, there was sort of you described this sort of these sort of valiant efforts to kind of make Molotov cocktails and the like, and which at some level felt sort of inspiring, but another level sort of tragic, because of course Molotov cocktails are vastly insufficient to withstand the Russian army, and but nonetheless, of course, Ukraine did defend itself quite successfully, and an invasion that was supposed to take, I think, in the range of 10 days, it was never achieved its goal of taking over the capital. So, what explains Ukrainian success? I mean, especially in the early days before sort of, significant Russian military assistance, reached the ground.
I mean, it's a great question. It's possibly the question, actually. I mean, it's and I spent a long time thinking about this, and I addressed this or some of this in a chapter towards the end of the book called "Horizontal" to describe the structure of Ukrainian society. And it's interesting on Molotov cocktails. I remember talking to someone in Lviv, one of the students that I wrote about. I made the same point. I said, what the fuck is the point in making a Molotov cocktail? You throw it at the tank, and why bother? And he said, yeah, I accept it's not going to stop the tank, but he said, the person driving the tank will know that they are hated, and that gives us a psychological advantage. And actually, that was very true. That the Russian soldiers coming in, trundling from Belarus through these, capturing the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on the first morning, February the 24th, then going through these forests as if it's some kind of vacation in the countryside. That they had been told there would be no resistance. That basically people would meet them with flowers and with sweets, and they'd be hoisting little children on their shoulders, and that they were saving Ukraine from vile Nazis who had taken over the country and enslaved the population. And this is part of the problem. Just to go back to Putin, is that I think he kind of believed his own propaganda. I mean, I call it late dictator syndrome. He'd been in power so long that he considers himself to be a brilliant spy, and yet either his spy agencies had given him a partial picture or they'd given him a wrong picture. Either way, he and his generals were just wildly naive about what kind of reception there would be. And to answer your question, I mean, I've talked to so many people from that spring involved in occupied villages around Kiev, and they saw these tank columns going past, sometimes in rows of 2-3 vehicles, helicopters clattering overhead, all ready to storm Kiev. And they would kind of smile and chat with the guys, and then they go back to their houses, and they would call up the Ukrainian army, and they would relay the coordinates to the Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainians had less artillery, but they used it better. And then they started smashing up these columns, and they were lighter, they were nimbler, there were teams of almost sort of partisans, Ukrainian partisans on quad bikes, like ghosts going through the forest with drones, and they would take out the first Russian tank, they would take out the last Russian tank, and then they would stop this giant slithering monster. And the Russians basically got bogged down. And by the middle of March, they were still stuck. And of course, what did they do in places like Bucha, Irpin, Gostomel, Borodyanka? What they did was they took out their frustration on the civilian population, who by this point, they concluded the civilian population were against them, were collaborating with the Ukrainian army, and therefore on some crazy level were traitors, fascists, whatever. And that's when we saw these executions in Bucha, these tortures, these death pits, these rapes. More than 1,600 people were civilians were killed, butchered in the Kiev region alone. And it was born out of the fact that the Russian plan was ridiculous.
Right. So, but what's interesting, of course, is that basically almost every, I mean, with a very few exceptions, vastly overestimated Russian military capacity. It was widely seen as the second largest army in the world. And certainly, but if you look at the sort of raw numbers of tanks and military spending, and also experience, I mean, Russia had experience in Syria and the like. Why do you think so many people overestimated Russian military capacity?
I think because they understood, if that's a word, how Russia works, Russian power, Russian politics, Russian society, that it's a profoundly corrupt place, first of all. So a lot of stuff on paper whether it's tanks or military equipment or fuel reserves, you can guarantee that half of it, more than half of it, will be stolen or won't work or will have broken down. So, I mean, that's one aspect, that the military actually was less effective. I mean, I think it's still a monster. It's a powerful monster, and we shouldn't underestimate it. It's killed very, very many people, but it's also a bit of a stupid monster. And I think the fact that the battle plan, what was a classic case of overreach, it was unbelievably arrogant and overweening to go from 3 directions. And their expectation was genuinely that Kiev would fall in a few days. And that they could subdue that, and Zelensky would be killed, his people around him would be killed as well. Puppet government, which had already been picked, identified, groomed. A lot of people were in Serbia, in Belgrade, waiting for the call. These are pro-Russian Ukrainians, mostly from the opposition bloc, that they would come in, that they would immediately sign a peace deal with Russia. And say, we are the pro-peace party, and they want war, we want peace, we want brotherly relations. And yes, there would be protests, there would be opposition, but that could all be mopped up by summer 2022. That's really what they expected. And the problem was that when that didn't work, when the special military operation, when the wheels fell off, they were involved in a kind of really brutal war. And also the Russian soldiers didn't really understand why they were there. I mean. I don't know who wrote the manifesto, but denazification, demilitarization, I mean, that's not a very clear war goal. And then subsequently, it morphed into liberating the Donbass. Then in the autumn, Putin annexed various territories, which he doesn't actually fully control. And then they became Russia. And actually, it's not really clear what it is. I mean, I think now finally they found a formula which they're happy with, which is that Russia is fighting a defensive war for its survival against the West, not against Ukraine, but against the US and Canada. That's where they've landed up after almost a year. But just one other thing on this is, you talk to any Ukrainian soldier and you say, why are you fighting? And they all say the same thing. I mean, I've been on the front line, I've talked to dozens of them. And they'll say, I'm fighting for my family, I'm fighting for my kids, I'm fighting for my village, I'm fighting for my country, I'm fighting for our survival, our right to be where we are, I'm fighting for freedom, for democracy. And you get pretty, ordinary soldiers who tell you all this stuff, and they tell you this stuff because it's true. And no one is making them fight. There's been no mobilization in Ukraine. They are fighting because they see that if Ukraine goes down, they are lost. They become slaves on some level. And they've also seen what happens in areas that Russia occupies. So there's a complete mismatch in morale, actually, between the two sides. And I think that is why Ukraine has done pretty well thus far.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure you've read these, British intelligence reports, the assessment of the early part of the war.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It's striking, just the sheer amount of, again, lack of a better term, stupidity of the Russian side. Sort of, for example, tanks would go down one street and get bombed, and they would continue sending more tanks down the same street rather than divert the route, and all sorts of things like that. I mean, it's striking to me that should we have predicted this level of stupidity? I mean, morale, yes. I mean, that was something that you should have. Any kind of invading army is going to have weaker morale than soldiers defending their homeland. But I'm wondering if, like, to what extent the sheer stupidity in the implementation of the war is something that is something we should have known ahead of time, or I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think we were possibly also dazzled by the fact that Russia does have nuclear weapons, and we have to assume that they work. So it seemed like a kind of unbeatable foe, actually. But there are plenty of good reasons for thinking that Putin won't actually use nuclear weapons, not least that deep down he's a coward and fears that were he to use them, the Americans would destroy him personally. And ultimately, I think he cares about survival, his physical survival and the survival of his regime. So the nuclear thing is a bluff. But yeah, I think initially we overestimated Russian military power, underestimated the Ukrainian will to resist. And I do also think that Ukraine's been lucky with Zelensky. I mean, the other Russian assumption was that Zelensky would flee, and that by this point he would probably be giving lectures in person at the monk school, among other sort of illustrious venues in North America. That he'd be on the circuit, and he would be a president in exile. And I think, and I write this, I think one of the turning points in the war was on day 3, when Zelensky did this gravel-voiced 40-second iPhone video outside his presidential office, Bankova in Kiev, where he just said, "Ya tut, ya tut," I'm here. And then there was another video where he said, Prime Minister is here, head of parliament is here, we are here, we are here, we are here. And what I just have to kind of convey to you is the mood in Kiev at the time was one of fear and dread. Most people thought in Kiev the Russians would come. Most people thought the Russians would prevail, that they would fly in, that they would secure government buildings, there were paratroopers dropped from the sky, and it would all be over pretty quickly. And that's why you saw millions of people fleeing in these gigantic traffic jams heading west, because, hey, I mean, not everyone is cut out for fighting. Not everyone has to, if you're someone with 3 kids, then probably you want to get them to safety. I mean, that was all kind of quite understandable. But Zelensky didn't flee. I mean, the US, the Turks, they would have facilitated his exfiltration for sure. They would have got him out. But he said he wasn't leaving. It was an incredible act of bravery, because he knew himself that if they got him, they would kill him.
Right. Absolutely. No, that's actually a great point. I mean, the fact that so many others were fleeing Kiev, and I remember my friends deciding, like, should I leave or should I go? That's sort of these sort of awful life decisions. And that was certainly remarkable, and also remarkable, the sort of turnaround in people's views of Zelensky. I mean, most of the diaspora here in Toronto and my friends from Western Ukraine hated him.
But I think they love him. They love him now.
They love him now. I mean, we actually had a session on his leadership, and I actually found my friend Volodymyr Kulik, I don't know if you know him, who has deep hate, really dislikes Zelensky, and he was, of course, he has to admit that he was a remarkable historical figure. So I'm just
sorry, just to say, just on that, just as a footnote, is you've got to bear in mind that the reason they hate him is because in 2019 he ran as the peace candidate. So Petro Poroshenko, the incumbent president, was definitely seen as being hawkish, tougher on Russia, tougher on Putin, a kind of bit of an iron guy who was gonna sort of keep faith in the military operation in the east. And the accusation against Zelensky was that he would just roll over. And certainly early on, he did try and find accommodation with Putin, but when he realized it wasn't going to work, that's when he kind of got tough and in a way sort of out Poroshenko. So all of the people who voted for him, who I knew in the military, pretty strong Ukraine people. I mean, they've also, like your friend, they've all flipped around. They all support him now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just have one question about collaboration. And I think on the Ukrainian side, so I think some people expected a lot, a lot more sort of local officials to kind of, convert to the Russian side. And certainly there was some attempt by the Russians, although not very subtle, to collaborate. And certainly it seems like the war would have gone very differently if heads of local governments had sort of sided with Putin, especially in the southeast. You would have seen a sort of, vastly greater Russian military success. I mean, do you have any thoughts on sort of what explains the relative absence of this kind of open, at least at the high level? I'm sure in Kherson we're still learning about sort of levels of collaboration there, but overall this seems to be much lower than we might have expected.
I mean, I think I go back to my point that the Ukraine 2022 was not Ukraine 2014. That actually the country had changed dramatically, and that people who really sympathize with the DNR, LNR, those two puppet entities in the east, a few went that way, far more people went the other way. These are kind of more educated middle-class Ukrainians who left places like Donetsk and Luhansk and settled in Ukrainian-controlled areas. I mean, there has been some collaboration, but it's been micro rather than macro. I mean, I had a couple of conversations about this. One that sticks with me. I talked to someone I met on what had been the front line until the autumn in Kharkiv Oblast in the northeast of the country. His village had been occupied, and I said, "Look, how many people stayed in your village?" He said about 112 of us stayed. Everyone else left, and he'd had a really tough time. At one point, a DNI guy had punched him in the face and called him a Nazi. They wanted them to wear white armbands, as if that they were sort of that they were signing off on the kind of Russian occupation project. And I said, well, how many people collaborated? And he said, Artyom and Sergey. two guys. And I said, well, what happened to Artyom and Sergei? And he said, oh, the SBU arrested them last week. That's the Ukrainian intelligence and counterintelligence service. And it was the same in Kherson. I mean, basically, they found a few local collaborators, people like Stremuzov, who's now dead, died in mysterious circumstances. He was a notorious kind of anti-vaxxer and pro-Russian blogger. I mean, everywhere they found someone. I mean, but the other interesting conversation I had, I talked to another guy, another Sergei in a village in Kherson province in the south called Mialova. And I got to Mialova the day after it was liberated. I was the first journalist in Mialova. There about 300 people stayed. And I said, well, how many collaborated? Answer was 10. A woman called Tatiana, who became the mayor, the pro-Russian mayor. Another woman who fell in love with a Russian soldier. And those 10 people all left with the Russians. And everyone else didn't. And that was kind of why the heads-on thing didn't work. And I sort of think, I don't want to predict the future, but if it goes badly for Russia this year, I can see a scenario where actually maybe they abandon Kherson and Zaporizhia and they try and keep what they've got in the Donbass, right, and refocus entirely on the east, abandon perhaps some of the south. I don't know, because they're hated there. They've got no support. I mean, it really is just a takeover and an occupation which only works through the application of terror and brute force. There's no basin, there's no pool. It's not Crimea. And again, this was magical thinking that it would be like Crimea all over again. It's not Crimea.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to talk about sort of, you spent a lot of time in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion, and as you know, and as people in the audience know, Ukraine before February 2022 was probably known for its intense levels of corruption, dysfunction, and being a highly divided society. Yet, as you sort of described quite eloquently in your book, I mean, this has sort of suddenly become this incredibly effective state that's sort of taken on sort of David and Goliath style, one of the most powerful armies in the world. I mean, what explains this transition? Where is all this corruption and dysfunction gone? I think I would be foolhardy to say that corruption has disappeared from Ukraine. I'm not saying that. I'm sure there is some corruption, but I think it's probably on a lower level because basically everyone is a patriot. Everybody is kind of bending. Everyone is doing something. And this whole idea of horizontal, I mean, it figures in volunteering. I mean, a lot of people are volunteering to go and fight. Some of them have died already. Some of them will die. Some of them have been injured. No one is making them do that. I've seen so many smashed up places. You drive along in Ukraine. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in areas northeast of Kiev, around Chernihiv, that Russia abandoned in late March of last year. And, I drive up through these kind of shredded communities. And on day 2, there were people trying to fix the bridge. There were crews, laying tarmac on the road. There were people shitting up electricity pylons, beginning to repair it. There were people sweeping up their yards where Russian tanks had been parked and trying to rescue their vegetables. And there's just an energy to make it work. And sure, there may be corruption, but there's just this kind of Putin's error is that he's actually fighting 40 million people. He's not fighting 400,000 soldiers. He's fighting everybody. So I think corruption will come back. I mean, the other thing is, I actually haven't written this piece, and I don't know if people have thoughts on this. I mean, they're very welcome to contact me. Is the oligarchs have been pretty quiet. I mean, we haven't heard much from Firtash is an exile. He's a dubious character anyway, but Kolomoisky, those people who used to dominate Ukrainian politics and in effect were shadow rulers, almost a sort of shadow cabinet. Their PR agencies will say that they're doing good and virtuous things, but their hold on practical politics for now is kind of dissipated. I mean, Zelensky and his team are all powerful. I mean, you might argue maybe too powerful, but for now, that power is being harnessed to a great national cause, which is Ukraine's survival and eventual victory. So I think the corruption's been dialed down, but I wouldn't say it's disappeared. Yeah, no, it is remarkable. I mean, of course, Zelensky was considered Kolomoisky's puppet back in the day. I mean, he's everybody worried about Kolomoisky and and the like. But you're absolutely right. That's a fascinating question. So I want to sort of go outside Ukraine now and talk a little bit about the sort of the Western reaction. I think to me, I think many of us in the Ukrainian, Ukrainian studies community in the University of Toronto, really worried in the spring that there was a sort of initial wave of sort of of sentiment in favor of Ukraine and the like. But I always thought, well, God, every conflict, people eventually become tired of hearing about Ukraine again and again, and Ukraine fatigue. But it does, correct me if I'm wrong, but it just, I don't see really strong evidence of Ukraine fatigue, despite it's been almost, close to a year now of the conflict and never ending. I get the New York Times every morning, and, it's mostly on the front page, vast majority of the time above the fold. So, do you agree that there's sort of been an absence of Ukraine fatigue, and sort of, if so, sort of, what explains it?
Yeah, I do. And also, this was another sort of category error by Putin. He again assumed that, as in 2014 with Crimea, there would be some grumbling, harsh words, some sanctions, but basically the West would kind of get over it. And I think his thinking all along was that he would get away with this kind of Ukraine recolonization project, and yes, there would be some economic consequences, but they would be survivable, and ultimately the West would flake. I think he's still assuming that this coalition will split, but you're right. I agree. If anything, the reverse is happening. It looks like the Brits and the Poles are now going to supply tanks. Not very many, but some for the first time. There's been an extraordinary amount of military assistance, military and economic assistance from the Biden administration. In excess, I think, now of $20 billion, which has allowed Ukraine to take back territory. I think without that contribution, we would not have seen those successful counteroffensives in the second half of last year from the Ukrainian side. But also, there's been this kind of political cohesion, which has been fascinating. I think. My God, after the disaster of the Trump years, I think the US has found a leadership role in Ukraine. It's proved once again that it is the essential power, that it can change reality. It can change what's happening on the battlefield in a way that no other country quite can. But also, I think it also the reason this coalition has stayed together is as a result of just brilliant outreach, messaging, emotional connection by the Zelensky administration and his team of showrunners. I've met them, I know them. They're TV people. They understand narrative. They understand how you tell a story. They, from the beginning, have saying this is good versus evil. They keep on making Lord of the Rings references. To the point where old ladies in Ukraine will now describe Russian soldiers as orcs. It's Lord of the Rings. Ukrainians are fighting Mordor. These hordes coming over from the east. Putin is Sauron, bit of an ailing Sauron, and you may laugh, but people understand. They understand these archetypes. They're very effective. And if you look at Zelensky's speeches to national parliaments, to the Canadian Parliament, to both houses of Congress in DC, to the British Parliament, they're really powerful. And one of the things I did in my book was to track down Zelensky's speechwriter, who's a unassuming guy, very bright, called Dmitry Litvin. And he didn't want to meet me, first of all, but then it turned out he'd read Mafia State, my book, which appeared in Ukrainian translation. He'd read it, and then he relented, and then we got on, and we've had a couple of coffees together. And he just writes very well. And Zelensky, who, by the way, I can reveal, likes poetry a lot. You listen to the cadence, the rhythm, the stress, and his speeches, which I've got actually. I've got them in English. I've got them in German. Various people send them to me. I think you could make a case that they are, on some level, they're kind of literary texts. But if you just think of the address to the British Parliament on day 13 of the invasion, where he references Shakespeare, Zelensky does, and then of course he references Churchill, and he starts saying, he echoes Churchill's famous speech. He says, we will fight them on the beaches. And then he says, and then he Ukrainizes it, and he says, we will fight them on the forests. We will fight them on the banks of the Kalmius, which is the river going through Mariupol. We will fight them on the slag heaps. We will never surrender. And you just read this text and you feel your spine tingling. And then, I mean, I write, it's almost like at the end, it's almost like a magical incantation. He talks about Veliki Britannia, Great Britain, Velika Ukraina, Great Ukraine. And it's as if he's binding these two countries together by some spell, by some benign magic spell. And it's so successful because what he's saying is this is not our struggle. This is not a local fight between two unhappy neighbors who have fallen out. This is essentially, and this is where he would agree with Putin, this is a struggle for the world order. This is a struggle for democracy. This is a struggle for decency, for civilization, for common values, for self-determination. And it works because it's powerfully expressed, and it works ultimately because it's true. And if Ukraine falls, then I can tell you here and now that Russia will keep going. They'll do Moldova. They'll circle around to the Baltics. They'll try and redeem Kaliningrad. Putin he won't stop until he is stopped. So the corollary of all that is we have to stop him, and we have to make sure he stays stopped.
Absolutely, that's a fascinating point about his rhetoric, and I will second this. A wonderful description of his speechwriter and some of the sort of mechanics behind his image creation. Nonetheless, I guess it is still surprising, his imaging aside, that you really, in my view, had the makings of kind of what I've called a sort of red-brown coalition in favor of Putin in Europe. The far right loves his authoritarianism, loves his anti-social change, his anti-gay stuff, and the far left hates, loves his anti-Americanism and loves his sort of bizarrely, sort of doesn't like the military-industrial complex, and hates the idea of the West, using weapons and the like. And I guess it is still surprising to me that he hasn't been able to do more with that. I mean,
I mean, they've tried. These guys who have been kind of trolling me forever and accused me of being a neocon, even though I work for the Guardian, of being a spy, of being a North Korean agent. I kind of lose track of the insults I've had. I mean, it's kind of hard. Some of them are real. Some of them I think are just Russian bots, play acting at being on the left, or on the kind of, the nationalist sort of anti-EU hard right. I mean, what we can say is that Putin has pretty successfully, over the last 2 decades, exploited divisions within our own societies. I mean, hence Donald Trump. I'm not saying that Putin caused Donald Trump, but he certainly identified him earlier on as someone who should be supported by Russia and Russian intelligence, and would wreak havoc were he to be elected, which indeed he did, and divide America, disunify the Western Alliance, undermine NATO, etc. All of these long cherished KGB goals. So these political vectors Putin has been pushing for ages, but he didn't get much traction with Ukraine. I mean, I do think that the sort of the red brown guys, I mean, they were saying very vociferously in the run-up to the invasion there would be no invasion, and we were all psychotic warmongers. And when there was a war, we were just discussing this before we went live. When the invasion happened, they've been pretty quiet. I mean, I sense now, a year on, they're beginning to regroup a little bit, but I think they're marginal. What's been fascinating is certainly in this country. I mean, less so in the US, with the American First movement, who seem to be kind of pro-Putin increasingly. But in the UK, there's been absolute cross-party consensus in support of Ukraine. And there've been a lot of Brits who've hosted Ukrainian refugees. I'm sure it's the same story in Canada. On a practical level, there's been a lot of support. And in a way, actually, it's the sort of grassroots response, the fact that people see these images and are just horrified, which has led to politics. The politicians have been taking their cue from ordinary people. And just lastly, to the point that you made earlier on, I mean, the Ukraine stories on The Guardian are very well read still. And we have an absolutely vast audience. We have a lot of people in Canada who read The Guardian, Australia, and half of our readers are from America. And you know, we're still going. I mean, we're sticking with this story until the end, and partly it's because we feel we ought to do it, but partly it's because the clicks are there.
Yeah, fascinating. So actually, I'm going to turn to one of the questions by one of the viewers, Benson Chung. She says, has the invasion made you reconsider topics you've covered before in a new light? For example, your assessment of Edward Snowden. Has this changed as a result of the war? I see sort of Edward Snowden, tweets. It's not very pretty tweets, I got to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. It's actually quite a tricky question. I mean, let me try and answer it honestly. I mean, so I wrote a book about Edward Snowden, for those who don't know, called the Snowden Files, which came out in 2014 after the leaks, these documents from the NSA, the American National Security Agency, which he gave to my newspaper, The Guardian, and to a few other people. And the book was very successful. It did, 25 international editions, was made into a movie by Oliver Stone, of all people, who is now really a kind of Putin apologist, unfortunately. And my view back then, when all this happened, was that Snowden was not a Russian asset. I don't think he was controlled by Russia. I don't think he was ordered to get this stuff and to leak it. I think he did it for his own libertarian reasons, as someone who came from the conservative part of American politics, not the left. He was never really a progressive, and I had some sympathy with the whole endeavor, because I think what he showed was massive overreach by Anglo-American spy agencies, to the point where everything we do on these things is still being omnisciently collected and put into what you might call kind of pre-criminal, very powerful pre-criminal systems, where if you pop up on the grid, they can pull all of your records in 5 seconds. So, and see who you've been, what you've been Googling, who you're in love with, who you're having an affair with, everything is there. So I thought what he did was important and correct. Unfortunately, recently he's become a Russian citizen, and his last few tweets have been, well, I mean, they've just been kind of echoing Putin propaganda, unfortunately, suggesting it's all the CIA's fault, what's going on in Ukraine, which is wrong and patronizing. And I don't know. I mean, his situation is tricky. I have some sympathy with him. I mean, he's stuck in Moscow. He's not going anywhere anytime soon. But it would be great if he could not tweet those things. But I'm not telling him what to do. Please don't see this as some scandalous intervention. I've got a lot of sympathy with his situation, but it's not the moment for amplifying Kremlin talking points.
Okay. So I just wanted to talk. So your book basically ends in sort of at the start of the counteroffensive, and it ends on a kind of quite, in my view, optimistic note, which seems certainly justified by the success of the counteroffensive, which I understand you're going to include in another edition. So how are you feeling now about the conflict?
I mean, I'm still broadly optimistic. I mean, the thing is, I mean, I guess ultimately this is a question about victory. What constitutes a Ukrainian victory? And I think what we can say with confidence is that Ukraine has not lost this war. In other words, the Putin expectation is that by now Ukraine would no longer exist, that it would be part of Russia, that there would be kind of overtures from Russian embassies around the world saying, you have to accept this new reality, you accepted Crimea, now you have to accept the fact that we've taken over Ukraine, and you may not like it, but deal with it. Deal with it. Russia is too important a partner to ignore. And by the way, you need our gas and our natural resources. So that was the expectation. We're in a totally different place. I mean, Ukraine is, but my last chapter is called A Proven State. It's proven itself as a country, as a political entity, as a community, a gramada, as a group of people who have not been vanquished, will not be vanquished, are prepared to sacrifice, everything to survive. And I try and write about their extraordinary fight back in invasion. So in that sense, the Putin project has failed and Ukraine has won. Now what happens on the battlefield, we have to see this year. I mean, I would expect, I mean, it looks like the Ukrainians have just lost Soledar, but I mean, in the east of the country, but that's after a remorseless 8-month offensive involving the whole Russian army, where they've taken one small town of 10,000 people. Now, that's not a great military victory. And I would expect both sides to do a kind of counteroffensive in the spring, but I think the Ukrainians have got a better chance of taking back some territory, and I would expect them to well, I mean, maybe they'll go after Melitopol in the south. Maybe they'll try and cross into Kherson province. Maybe they'll try and push around Crimea in the east. I don't know, but I think they will have some success. I mean, can they deoccupy all of their territory by the end of this year? I think that's unlikely. But can they make further progress? I think they can. The problem is, for the Ukrainians, it's existential, and for Putin, on some level, it's the same. If he loses this war, then his kind of regime is sort of over. I mean, if they keep on going backwards, it's very hard to explain that to the Russian people, which is why they're going to mobilize again. I think he's going to throw 1 million people into this battle. I don't think that will necessarily change the dynamics on the battlefield, but the war will continue, unfortunately. But I think Ukraine will be edging forward this year.
Yeah, great. So just one last question, then we're going to wrap it up. Can you just tell us a little bit about what it's like working in Ukraine? I mean, there's I think martial law on the books, at least, and I mean, are you able to go anywhere, or what is I mean,
yeah, I mean, you can go pretty much anywhere. I mean, you need accreditation, which everybody gets. But by the way, a little shout out for Mark McKinnon from the Global Mail. I've worked a lot with him in the field, and we were together on the morning of February the 24th. And I feel bonded with the Global Mail forever as a result of these experiences. And there's some great journalism being produced by Canadian reporters, by Ukrainian reporters and journalists and writers, by all sorts of people. And look, I've got a Ukrainian driver, Oleg. We have to have a security guard with us when we go to the front line. You've got pretty good access. I mean, you can't go to the front of the front line because unless you're embedded with a Ukrainian unit, because you'll probably get killed. But you can get pretty close. I mean,
you got pretty close.
Oh yeah, close enough to have Russian shells, whistling over our heads, which is basically too close. One thing, Lucan, if you hear the boom, that's outgoing. If whoosh, that's outgoing grad. If you hear the whistle, then it's time to take cover or scarper, run away. Basically, I'm very much in favor of running away if it gets too sketchy. So yeah, I've worked with some great Ukrainians. It's been possible because of their assistance, but essentially they let you tell the story, and you can sit in Kiev, you can go to the front line, you can interview whoever. It's the way it's the way it should be. It's a democratic society, and basically you can write what you want. And I'm going back in February, and we'll take the warm wishes of the monk school with me if you'll pass them on to Ukraine and to the people I meet.
Absolutely. Actually, I'm just going to do one more question of this.
Sure.
A few more minutes. Which
sure.
It's remarkable to me. I mean, one might have thought that given the fact that Russia's invaded, that there would be more sort of reports of human rights abuses against Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian side. There have been a few, but especially, there haven't been that many reports as far as I know. And, this is a country, as you said, which is, there are many Western journalists. And so if there were sort of such activity going on, one would expect it to be reported. So, I mean, what explains the sort of relative discipline of the Ukrainian troops? I mean, in your view, or I mean, do you disagree? Or
yeah, I mean, actually, I haven't got a very considered answer on this. I mean, I'm sure some abuses take place. I mean, it's a war. It would be inconceivable they don't. I think you'd kind of have to be there to catalogue that. What I can say with certainty is that the Ukrainian army does not do what the Russian army has been doing routinely. And I've been around torture chambers in a Zoom with people who were tortured there, who've shown me around. I've seen mass graves of civilians and soldiers, some with their hands behind their backs, who've been executed or murdered in various ways. So there may be abuses, but not on the same scale. I think the Ukrainians are more practical. I mean, they know that the international community is watching, so they're going to be held to a higher standard. They also want Russian soldiers to swap for their own people. There's no point in shooting a Russian soldier in the head. Far more valuable to keep him and to trade him and to get back some of the guys who are languishing in absolutely terrible conditions in Russian prisons. So yeah, I mean, they're not perfect, but I think that they understand social media. They understand that were they to do this stuff, it would probably come out. They're very, very conscious of their reputation internationally, and I think on some level they want to show that they're better than the Russians, which they are.
Okay, we'll end on that note. That's a good note to end on. So thank you so much. This is a fantastic book. I encourage you to buy it. I've seen it at bookstores, so and or Amazon or whatever you want. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great chat. You know, warm regards to you, to the school, to Toronto, and do keep in touch. Thanks very much.
Okay, ciao.
Ciao.